In the late summer of 73 BCE, the Roman Republic stood as the unchallenged hegemon of the Mediterranean world, yet its internal structures were hollowed out by a systemic crisis. The third and final Servile War, led by the Thracian gladiator Spartacus, was not merely a localized insurrection of desperate captives. It was a structural earthquake that exposed the deep socio-economic and military vulnerabilities of the late Republic. Unlike the previous slave rebellions in Sicily, which were geographically contained by the sea, the Spartacus Revolt erupted in the Italian heartland, directly threatening the capital and humiliating the Roman military machine. The panic that gripped the Roman Senate and citizenry during these 3 years was comparable to the existential dread experienced during the invasion of the Carthaginian general Hannibal Barca. This terror, historically conceptualized as Servilis Terror, arose from the disturbing realization that the very foundation of Roman prosperity, the systematic exploitation of millions of foreign captives, had created an active, armed enemy within the household and the state. Section 1. The demographic inversion of the Italian peninsula. The socio-economic landscape of 1st century BCE Italy was shaped by the radical transformations that followed Rome's rapid imperial expansion. For generations, the backbone of Roman military and agricultural power had been the free peasant soldier. These smallholders tilled their family plots in times of peace and served in the legions when the Republic called. However, the catastrophic devastation of the Second Punic War, 218-202 BCE, under the invasion of Hannibal, altered this demographic balance. Hannibal systematically laid waste to much of Etruria and southern Italy, killing farmers and destroying agricultural infrastructure. As Rome's wars of conquest expanded overseas into Hispania, Greece, and Macedonia, returning legionaries often found their family farms bankrupt or absorbed by wealthy neighbors. Under these crippling economic pressures, veterans preferred the spirit of the plow, selling their ancestral lands to wealthy patricians and migrating to urban centers like Rome, where they became part of the growing urban poor. This consolidation of land birthed the Latifundia, massive plantation-like estates owned by senatorial elites and wealthy business magnates. To maximize profit margins, these landholders replaced free peasant workers with foreign slaves, who were cheap, abundant, and exempt from military service. The Greek historian Appian of Alexandria observed that the rich used persuasion or force to seize adjoining smallholdings, operating great ranches worked by slave hands to avoid having free men dragged off the land to serve in the army. Consequently, the powerful grew incredibly rich, and the number of slaves in the countryside reached massive proportions, while the Italian citizenry suffered from depopulation, poverty, and unemployment. By the beginning of the 1st century BCE, Italy was saturated with an estimated 2 million slaves out of a total population of approximately 6 million. This demographic imbalance created a psychological climate of perpetual anxiety among the Roman ruling class. The Roman elite operated under the terrifying realization that they were heavily outnumbered by an exploited, foreign-born underclass. This anxiety was encapsulated in the chilling Roman proverb, quote Servi, tot hostes, as many enemies as there are slaves. The proverb reflected a consensus of underlying hostility. The masters understood that by stripping captives of their freedom, they had established a state of natural enmity. The depth of this systemic fear is illustrated by the Senate's rejection of a policy to force slaves to wear a standardized, distinctive garb. Senators realized that if the enslaved population were visually unified, they would comprehend their overwhelming numerical superiority, potentially inciting a coordinated, peninsula-wide revolution. Section 2. The Capuan Spark and the Gladiatorial Subversion. The specialized subset of Roman slavery that ultimately ignited this demographic powder keg was the gladiatorial system. Gladiatorial schools, or ludi, functioned as highly secure, fortress-like prisons designed to train captives in the art of hand-to-hand combat to perform in public games designed to entertain Roman crowds. The discipline within these facilities was notoriously draconian, featuring constant grueling exercise, strict dietary constraints, and harsh punishments for even the minor offenses. In the city of Capua, located in the wealthy region of Campania, a businessman named Lentulus Batiatus operated a prominent ludus. Within his facility, a diverse group of Thracian, Celtic, and Germanic captives chafed under these relentless constraints. In the spring of 73 BCE, a group of approximately 200 gladiators plotted a mass escape. Although the conspiracy was betrayed, approximately 70 to 78 gladiators managed to execute a desperate breakout. Lacking proper military equipment, the escapees rushed the school's kitchens, weaponizing domestic implements such as meat spits, heavy cleavers, and kitchen knives to overpower the armed guards. As they fled through the streets of Capua, they had the immense fortune of intercepting a transport wagon carrying authentic gladiatorial arms destined for another theater, allowing them to discard their kitchen utensils for proper shields, swords, and tridents. Once clear of the city, the escapees established a democratic leadership structure, electing 3 primary commanders: Crixus and Oenomaus, both of Gallic origin, and Spartacus, a Thracian. Historical sources indicate that Spartacus was a man of immense physical strength, high intelligence, and charismatic leadership. He had previously served as an auxiliary mercenary in the Roman cavalry before deserting, turning to brigandage, and ultimately being captured and sold into the gladiatorial trade. This background provided Spartacus with intimate first-hand knowledge of Roman military tactics, logistics, and organizational structure, a factor that would prove catastrophic for the Roman military establishment. He was assigned to the heavy Murmillo class of gladiators, which required him to train with a large rectangular shield, scutum, and a short sword, gladius, though he also favored the curved Thracian scimitar called the sica. This rigorous training meant that the escapees were not merely desperate runaways, but elite, professional shock troops capable of besting standard Roman soldiers in close-quarters combat. Historically, the organizing of gladiator fights, known as munera, had evolved from private funeral rites meant to honor deceased family members into powerful political tools used by Roman politicians to curry favor with the electorate. The system relied on the absolute dehumanization of the combatants, transforming them into expendable stage props. By rising in rebellion, Spartacus and his cohort inverted this dynamic, turning the very weapons and martial training provided by their oppressors back upon the Republic. Furthermore, during the subsequent campaigns, Spartacus famously organized mock gladiatorial games using captured Roman soldiers. In one notable instance, following the death of his co-commander Crixus, Spartacus forced 300 high-ranking Roman prisoners to fight to the death to honor the fallen rebel leader. This symbolic inversion was a calculated act of psychological warfare. By forcing citizens of the master class to perform the degrading role of the gladiator, Spartacus openly mocked Roman socio-political institutions and demonstrated that the masters were just as vulnerable to the violence they had institutionalized. Section 3. Tactical Genesis and Early Roman Defeats. Immediately following their escape, the gladiators sought refuge on the slopes of Mount Vesuvius, a dormant volcano whose rugged topography offered an ideal defensive position. The Roman Senate, initially viewing the crisis as a minor law enforcement issue rather than a military threat, dispatched the propraetor Gaius Claudius Glaber with a hastily conscripted, untrained militia force of 3,000 soldiers. Glaber's strategy was simple. Rather than attempting a costly assault up the steep slopes, he blockaded the single narrow pathway leading down from the summit, intending to starve the rebels into submission. Spartacus, however, recognized that siege warfare favored the Romans and executed a brilliant tactical innovation. He ordered his men to cut the wild grapevines that blanketed the crater of Vesuvius and weave them into long, incredibly sturdy ropes and ladders. Under the cover of darkness, the rebels used these vine ropes to rappel down the sheer, unguarded cliffside opposite Glaber's blockade. Creeping silently around the base of the mountain, the gladiators outflanked the sleeping Roman camp and launched a devastating surprise attack from the rear. The untrained Roman militia panicked and fled, leaving their camp and military supplies to be looted by the insurgents. This stunning victory transformed a local breakout into a full-scale regional insurrection. Escaped agricultural slaves, local shepherds, herdsmen, and disaffected free peasant farmers began flocking to Vesuvius, rapidly expanding the rebel ranks. Alarmed by Glaber's failure, Rome dispatched a second expedition led by the praetor Publius Varinius. In a severe tactical error, Varinius divided his forces under his subordinates, Furius and Cassinius, attempting to coordinate a multi-pronged encirclement. Spartacus exploited this division with remarkable agility. He first intercepted and routed the force of 2,000 men under Furius, then pursued Cassinius, capturing his camp and supplies, and eventually killing him. Finally, Spartacus turned his victorious army against Varinius himself, utterly defeating his main force. In the aftermath of this battle, Spartacus captured Varinius's personal warhorse and lictors, a humiliating blow to the symbols of Roman magisterial authority. With Varinius's legions destroyed, the rebel army, now numbering over 70,000, effectively controlled the fertile Campanian countryside. They spent the winter of 73-72 BCE raiding and occupying prominent southern Italian cities, including Nola, Nuceria, Thurii, and Metapontum. During this period, Spartacus oversaw the systematic training and arming of his recruits, converting a disorganized mass of traumatized captives into a highly disciplined, cohesive fighting force. He also established a highly effective cavalry unit, utilizing the rugged horses captured from local herdsmen and Roman outposts. Section 4. The Strategic Fracture and the Consular Crisis of 72 BCE. By 72 BCE, the rebellion had escalated into a national crisis, prompting the Senate to mobilize the regular consular armies under the consuls Lucius Gellius Publicola and Gnaeus Cornelius Lentulus Clodianus, along with the praetors Quintus Arrius and Gnaeus Manlius. At this critical juncture, however, profound ideological and ethnic divisions fractured the rebel coalition. The slave army was not a monolithic group. It comprised diverse nationalities primarily divided between Mediterranean captives, like Spartacus, and Northern European Celts and Germans, under Crixus. Spartacus advocated for a strategic retreat northward, intending to march the army across the Alps, allowing his followers to return to their ancestral homelands in Gaul, Germania, and the Balkans. Conversely, Crixus and his Germanic and Gallic followers, intoxicated by their early victories, wished to remain in Italy to plunder the incredibly wealthy Roman estates. This disagreement led to a fateful division of forces. Crixus split from the main army with approximately 30,000 men, marching east into Apulia to ravage the countryside. The Roman consuls quickly exploited this strategic blunder. The consul Gellius Publicola launched a surprise attack on the Germanic contingent under Crixus near Monte Gargano in northern Apulia. In the ensuing pitched battle, the Roman legions crushed the rebel division, killing Crixus and destroying 2/3 of his force. While Gellius was crushing Crixus, the other consul, Lentulus Clodianus, marched north to intercept Spartacus's advancing column in the Apennine Mountains. Spartacus, displaying exceptional operational mobility, engaged Lentulus and defeated him in a rapid, decisive action. He then turned back to confront Gellius, who was pursuing him from the rear. Through a series of brilliant maneuvers, Spartacus defeated both consular armies separately, captured their equipment, and continued his march northward toward the Po Valley. At Mutina, modern Modena, the governor of Cisalpine Gaul, Gaius Cassius Longinus, attempted to block Spartacus's path with a provincial army of 10,000 men. Spartacus utterly shattered Cassius's legions, forcing the proconsul to flee for his life. At this precise moment, the path to the Alps and total freedom was completely open. The rebel army had defeated every military force the Republic had thrown at them, and they stood on the threshold of escaping Roman territory. Yet in one of the most baffling decisions in military history, Spartacus turned his massive army back to the south. Ancient historians offer varying explanations for this sudden pivot. Plutarch suggests that the rank-and-file rebels, emboldened by their undefeated record and laden with plunder, refused to cross the freezing, inhospitable Alps and forced Spartacus to lead them back into Italy to continue raiding. Other modern analyses suggest that Spartacus realized that migrating such a vast host of women, children, and elderly through the mountainous northern passes in winter was logistically impossible, or that he hoped to join forces with the massive slave population of Sicily. Regardless of the exact motivation, this decision marked the turning point of the war as it brought the rebels back into the direct path of a deeply terrified and highly mobilized Roman state. During the march south, Spartacus implemented brutal measures to maximize mobility. He decided not to accept new fugitives, butchered all non-essential pack animals, burned useless military equipment, and put his Roman prisoners to death to prevent them from slowing down his army. According to Appian, Spartacus's army now numbered an astonishing 120,000 foot soldiers, a force larger than any single Roman army of the era. Section 5. The dictatorial rise and brutal mechanics of Crassus. The sudden turn south of the rebel army plunged Rome into a state of panic comparable to the darkest days of the Punic Wars. With the consular armies discredited and defeated, the Senate took the extraordinary step of relieving the disgraced consuls of their command and granting special proconsular imperium to Marcus Licinius Crassus. Crassus, a veteran lieutenant of Lucius Cornelius Sulla and the wealthiest man in Rome, had built his colossal fortune through real estate speculation, silver mines, and purchasing the confiscated properties of those executed during Sulla's proscriptions. Crassus was an extremely ambitious and cunning military general who viewed the slave revolt as a launchpad for his political career. To build a platform of absolute obedience, he raised 6 new legions out of his own pocket, combining them with the remnants of the consular armies to form a massive force of approximately 40 to 50,000 heavy infantry. To understand the intense paranoia of the Roman elite at this moment, one must examine the historical precedent of Sulla's dictatorship and the use of slave accomplices during the civil wars of the previous decade. In 88 BCE, Sulla had issued a hostis declaration against his rival Marius and offered freedom and financial rewards to any slave who would betray their master. One slave responded, betraying the tribune Sulpicius. Sulla kept his promise. He officially manumitted the slave, but then immediately had him thrown from the Tarpeian Rock, the traditional punishment for treason and violation of trust, fades, to signal that the betrayal of a master, even an outlawed one, was a fundamental crime against the social order. By 82 BCE, however, during his bloody proscriptions, Sulla inverted this rule, executing any citizen who sheltered a proscribed person and rewarding slaves who killed their prescribed masters with freedom and bounties. This manipulation of slave loyalty during Roman civil wars had severely destabilized the security of the elite, creating a deep-seated fear that their own household slaves might turn on them to purchase their freedom from the state. Crassus recognized that the primary cause of Roman military failure against Spartacus was a systemic collapse of discipline and morale among the troops. He immediately deployed his lieutenant, Mummius, with 2 legions to shadow Spartacus's movements, strictly commanding him to avoid engaging the enemy. Mummius, however, seeking personal glory, disobeyed orders and offered battle. Spartacus's veteran rebels comprehensively routed the Roman legions. Thousands of soldiers threw down their weapons and fled in terror. Crassus's response to this cowardice was swift, brutal, and historically unprecedented for the late Republic. He revived the ancient, long-abandoned military punishment of decimation, decimatio. Taking 500 of the primary instigators of the flight, Crassus divided them into 50 groups of 10. In each group, the soldiers drew lots, and the unlucky individual was beaten to death by his remaining 9 comrades. This horrific ritual was conducted in front of the entire assembled army. By executing approximately 50 of his own men, Crassus sent an unmistakable, chilling message to his legions. Their commander was far more dangerous than the enemy, and cowardice would guarantee a painful, shameful death. Section 6. The Siege of Rhegium and the Winter Breakout. Having re-established absolute authority over his legions, Crassus marched against Spartacus, driving the rebel army southward through Lucania toward the toe of Italy, the peninsula of Rhegium. Spartacus sought to cross the narrow straits of Messina into Sicily, hoping to rekindle the previous servile wars on an island teeming with agricultural slaves. He entered into negotiations with Cilician pirates, paying them with accumulated plunder to transport 2,000 of his men across the straits. However, the pirates pocketed the payment, betrayed the rebels, and sailed away, leaving the slave army stranded on the shore. Crassus took immediate advantage of this geographical isolation. He ordered his massive army to construct an extraordinary engineering work across the Rhegium Isthmus, a continuous fortification wall and deep trench stretching 60 kilometers, 300 furlongs, from sea to sea. The trench was 15 feet wide and 15 feet deep, topped by a formidable, heavily garrisoned wooden palisade. This massive barrier kept Crassus's legions actively occupied while physically trapping Spartacus's army within the narrow peninsula, cutting off all local foraging and supply lines. As winter set in, provisions within the Rhegium Peninsula dwindled and the rebel army faced slow starvation. Spartacus attempted several localized skirmishes against the wall, but was repeatedly repelled. Recognizing that a prolonged siege meant certain death, Spartacus waited for a severe, howling February snowstorm. Under the cover of zero visibility and driving snow, the rebel leader launched a highly coordinated breakout. To bypass the massive obstacle, Spartacus ordered his men to fill in a narrow section of the Roman trench using whatever materials were at hand: earth, tree branches, the carcasses of slaughtered pack animals, and the frozen corpses of executed Roman prisoners. This makeshift land bridge allowed approximately one-third of the rebel army to storm across the fortifications, overwhelm the dazed Roman sentries, and escape into the open fields of Lucania. Section 7, the Salaris River and the Extinction of the Rebellion. Although Spartacus had successfully escaped the blockade, the rebel coalition was once again fractured by internal divisions. A large contingent of Gallic and Germanic fighters, led by Castus and Canicus, split from Spartacus's main column, establishing their own independent camp. Crassus pursued this breakaway force, trapping them near the headwaters of the Salaris River and annihilating them in a bloody engagement, killing over 12,000 rebels. Meanwhile, political pressures were rapidly mounting in Rome. The Senate, growing impatient with the length of the campaign, bypassed Crassus's authority and recalled Pompey the Great from his victorious campaigns in Hispania, as well as Marcus Terentius Varro Lucullus from Macedonia. This was a devastating political blow to Crassus. If Pompey arrived before the rebellion was crushed, he would easily claim credit for ending the war, depriving Crassus of the military glory he desperately craved. Spartacus, too, was under immense pressure. He knew that if the legions of Pompey and Lucullus converged with Crassus's army, the rebels would be trapped in an inescapable pincer movement. He attempted to negotiate a peace settlement with Crassus, but the Roman commander, seeking absolute destruction, flatly refused. Realizing that their only chance of survival was to destroy Crassus's army in a decisive pitched battle before Pompey's arrival, the rebel rank and file forced Spartacus to turn and face the pursuing legions. To add to this desperation, Spartacus's forces had managed a temporary victory over two of Crassus's lieutenants, Quintus Marcius Rufus and Gnaeus Tremellius Scrofa, during their retreat toward Petelia. This minor success had inflated the overconfidence of the slave army, who refused to continue retreating and demanded to face the Romans in open combat. In the spring of 71 BCE, the two armies met in a massive pitched battle near the headwaters of the Salaris River, located in modern Campania. Before the battle commenced, Spartacus executed a dramatic piece of psychological theater. He rode his warhorse before his assembled troops, drew his sword, and slew the animal in front of them. He declared to his men that if they won the day, they would have thousands of superior Roman horses to choose from. If they lost, they would have no need for a horse. This act symbolized the absolute finality of their struggle. There was no path of retreat, only victory or death. To further bolster their resolve and demonstrate the brutal stakes of surrender, Spartacus had previously crucified a captured Roman soldier in the no-man's land between the two armies, illustrating the agonizing, degrading death that awaited them if they failed to break the Roman line. The battle was fought with extreme ferocity. Spartacus, recognizing that the Roman command structure relied heavily on Crassus, attempted to end the battle in a single stroke. Leading a desperate charge directly through the thickest part of the melee, Spartacus fought his way toward Crassus. He personally slew 2 centurions and several high-ranking officers who stood in his path. However, before he could reach the Roman general, he was surrounded by Roman legionaries. Spartacus was struck in the thigh by a spear, bringing him down to one knee. Despite this crippling wound, He continued to fight off his attackers with his shield and short sword until he was finally overwhelmed and killed. His body was so badly mangled during the chaotic melee that it was never recovered from the battlefield. While the Battle of the Silurus River destroyed the organized rebel army, it was the horrific aftermath of the campaign that cemented the Spartacus Revolt in the historical memory of Rome. Approximately 6,000 rebel survivors fled into the mountains of Lucania and Bruttium, attempting to escape northward. However, Pompey the Great, marching south with his veteran Spanish legions, intercepted this disorganized band, systematically slaughtering 5,000 of them. Pompey immediately sent a dispatch to the Senate, declaring that while Crassus had defeated the slaves in open battle, he himself had ended the war, claiming a large portion of the credit and earning the permanent enmity of Crassus. To assert his undisputed dominance and send an unforgettable warning to the Roman slave population, Crassus executed a display of state terror on an unprecedented scale. He ordered the 6,000 rebel prisoners captured at the Silurus River to be crucified along the Via Appia, the Appian Way, the primary highway stretching 200 kilometers from Capua, where the rebellion had first sparked, directly to the gates of Rome. For years, the decomposing corpses of these crucified captives lined the highway, serving as a graphic reminder to every traveling merchant, senator, and slave of the absolute, merciless power of the Roman state. Section 8, Structural Transformation, the long-term impact on Rome. The political fallout of the Third Servile War accelerated the structural collapse of the Roman Republic. Despite their mutual animosity, both Crassus and Pompey recognized that their military commands gave them immense leverage over the civilian government. They refused to disband their legions, marching them to the very outskirts of Rome. Using the implied threat of military force and the immense public acclaim from ending the slave war, they forced the Senate to grant them a joint consulship for the year 70 BCE, despite Pompey being technically ineligible due to his age and lack of traditional senatorial offices. Their actions as consuls systematically dismantled Sulla's conservative constitutional reforms, severely weakening the traditional institutions of the Republic and paving the way for the rise of militarized warlords like Julius Caesar. Within 4 years of Crassus's death at the Battle of Carrhae in 53 BCE, the political counterbalance between Caesar and Pompey unraveled, prompting Caesar to cross the Rubicon and launch the civil war that would ultimately transform the Roman Republic into the Roman Empire. On a socio-economic level, the shock of the Spartacus Revolt forced a profound long-term reassessment of Roman slavery and agricultural labor. The Roman elite had looked into the abyss of a massive, coordinated slave revolution on their own doorsteps, and the sheer terror of Servilis Terror prompted a gradual shift in how agricultural labor was managed. Landowners realized that massive concentrations of foreign agricultural slaves, while profitable, were highly unreliable, dangerous, and required constant, expensive military protection. Consequently, in the decades following the revolt, the Latifundia system began to evolve. Wealthy landowners gradually reduced their reliance on large gangs of agricultural slaves. Instead, they began partitioning their vast estates and renting them out to free, landless Roman citizens, known as Coloni, in exchange for rent and a share of the harvest. This transition from pure chattel slavery to a system of tenant sharecropping represented a major structural precursor to the feudal manor systems of medieval Europe. Furthermore, although the institution of slavery survived, the treatment of slaves underwent a gradual legal and cultural transformation. The Roman elite realized that treating slaves with unmitigated cruelty was a recipe for future insurrections. Writers and philosophers such as Seneca began advocating for more humane treatment, arguing that slaves were human beings endowed with reason and deserved decent living conditions. Over the next 2 centuries, this shift in attitude was codified into imperial law. Under the Emperor Claudius, reigned 41-54 AD, a constitution was enacted that made the killing of an old or infirm slave an act of murder and decreed that if such slaves were abandoned by their owners, they became freedmen. Under Antoninus Pius, reigned 138-161 AD, laws further extended these rights, holding owners responsible for the killing of their own slaves, forcing the sale of slaves when it could be shown that they were being mistreated and providing a neutral third-party magistrate to which a slave could appeal. While these legal changes occurred much too late to be direct results of the Third Servile War, they represent the legal codification of changes in the Roman attitude towards slaves that evolved over decades, directly traced back to the structural shock and ancestral dread established by Spartacus. Conclusion. The Spartacus Revolt terrified Rome because it was not a distant imperial skirmish, but a domestic earthquake that exposed the fundamental vulnerability at the heart of Roman civilization. By transforming their own captured property into a highly trained, tactically brilliant military force, the gladiators shattered the illusion of Roman military invincibility. The rebellion demonstrated that the very system that generated Rome's immense wealth, the exploitation of millions of foreign slaves, had created a demographic time bomb within the Italian heartland. The structural ripples of the conflict accelerated the collapse of the Roman Republic by concentrating unprecedented military and political power in the hands of ambitious commanders like Crassus and Pompey, who used the national panic to bypass traditional constitutional norms. In crushing the rebellion, Rome was forced to adopt the brutal measures of sullen decimation and the mass crucifixions of the Appian Way, showing that the maintenance of a slave society ultimately required the absolute militarized suppression of human liberty. Ultimately, Spartacus failed to secure the freedom of his followers, but his rebellion shook the foundations of the Roman world, permanently altering the socio-economic structure of ancient Italy and leaving a legacy of defiance that has echoed through millennia.